Oliver, if I'm to believe in the Judeo-Christian God, I have to believe in some kind of an afterlife and a judgment. Do you believe that for temporal sin that people would do within a lifetime measured in decades, that an eternal punishment is justified?
I think certainly that's the almost unanimous teaching of the Christian tradition. There's a minority report on the question of judgment that pushes in the direction of what's called universalism, the idea that everybody ultimately is saved. But the vast majority of the Christian tradition says that yes, the biblical tradition teaches that there's a separation between two sorts of people, those who are saved and those who are not saved. And the issue then is about who it is that's saved and whether you're a member of those people who are saved or not, and what happens to those people who spend an everlasting time in being punished in hell, and what the nature of that punishment is. I think it's important to say, though, right at the outset, that if one is to talk about hell, and of course it's a very unpleasant prospect to talk about hell, there's a distinction to be made between what we might call the infinite punishment thesis, in other words, the claim that the punishment that's served in hell is an infinite one, and the actual nature of that punishment, that the kind of form the punishment takes. Often in kind of lurid pictures of hell, the idea is that people are burning everlastingly. Isn't this terrible? How could God do this? He's a kind of tyrant. But it's no necessary part of the traditional doctrine of hell that the punishment takes a particular form. What is a part of the traditional doctrine is that that punishment is infinite. It goes on and on and on forever.
And is it irredeemable? Is there any chance that any one of those individuals can say, you know, I've had enough, I see the light, I would rather stop this, and I'm sorry, and repent, or whatever I have to do?
Well, again, the majority voice in the tradition is no, that this is a kind
I don't care about the majority,
breach.
I care about you. What do you think?
Yeah. I mean, I think that, no, those who are in hell, my sense anyway is that those who are in hell are in there everlastingly, and that the punishment they serve is a punishment that goes on. Now, it may be that obtains...
And nobody, without exception, nobody's going to get out.
That's right, nobody's going to get out. And
how does that make you feel?
Well, I guess sad in a way. I mean, but I think it's important to recognize that...
Are you going to ask God about that, or that's off limits?
Well, I'm sure I could ask God about that, yeah. But I think what I wanted to say was I think it's important to realize that when we're not necessarily talking about, you know, the vast majority of humankind, it might be that it's a very small minority of people that end up being everlastingly separated from God. And it may be that the reason for that is not just that they're being punished in hell, but that they continue to refuse the presence of God everlastingly. It may be that they've so formed a kind of habit, that a character, that that they're continuing to act in a way separate from God that would mean that they never have any space, as it were, moral space to turn and receive divine grace.
Even if what they've done is in less than 100 years, our universe is almost 14 billion years old, and that is not even a speck in the vast expanse of eternity.
Yeah.
And here we're dealing with what persons may do in their conscious life, which should be measured in a few decades at worst.
Yeah. No. Exactly. And I mean, one possibility here is that those who are in hell continue to sin, and so therefore you might have a punishment served for a certain period of time, but if you continue to act in an immoral fashion, then you continue to serve a subsequent punishment, and so on. And if you continue to sin, then that's what continues to happen.
But if that's true, then if you don't, then you have chance for reform.
For salvation and reform. Right, but I guess the idea is that because we're inherently sinful, we've got a kind of bias towards sin, that if you continue to live in an irredeemed state, then you're going to continue to have that bias that will manifest itself in sinful actions.
Why are we that way? Why are we fundamentally, why did God create us in that way, that we're fundamentally sinful, so that people are going to wind up that way?
Well, I don't think it's that God created us fundamentally that way, at least, once again, that's not the teaching of the Christian faith, but rather that God created us with a certain kind of freedom and ability to make our own moral choices and be moral agents. And we misuse that freedom and therefore find ourselves in a morally disordered state, as a consequence of which certain things come into play in terms of moral responsibility and punishment for things that we
Sure, and that makes sense. It's just that people change.
Right, people change. I mean, so there's there's this one way of thinking about hell is that you continue to sin, and so you continue to get punished. That's one way of thinking about it. Another way of thinking about it is this: perhaps the sin that we commit is measured in accordance with the status of the person that you commit the sin against, in some sense. So that if we sin against a being who has infinite merit and is infinitely beautiful and wonderful and glorious and so on, that the sin that we commit generates, as it were, a commensurate demerit. In other words, a demerit that's also an infinite demerit, given the infinite nature of the person against whom you sin. And so therefore, the punishment that's served is an infinite punishment and a consequence of sinning against a being of infinite beauty and glory and holiness and so on.
Well, that sounds sounds like a petulant God.
Well, I'm not sure that it's a petulant God. I think the idea is that God is holy. God is just as well as being loving.
These poor people who just sinned for a few decades, I mean, they barely knew that. There was, maybe they, what did they do to deserve that type of eternal punishment?
Well, I think the idea is that if you sin against a being of infinite worth, then that sin carries infinite consequences, even if you're not someone who thinks that sin has those sorts of consequences.
Tough luck.
Tough luck.